The terrifying reality that Jung refused to publish. What happens when men actually become whole? Carl Jung discovered something so disturbing about self-actualized men that he kept it hidden in his private journals for decades, afraid that revealing this truth would destroy the motivation of men seeking psychological development. What he found wasn't inspiring or uplifting. It was a brutal reality that challenged everything society believed about success, happiness, and human fulfillment. Jung's most shocking discovery was that men who achieved true self-actualization didn't become happier, more successful, or more satisfied with life. Instead, they became something far more unsettling. They became completely indifferent to the things that drove other men to desperation, and this indifference made them both incredibly powerful and profoundly isolated from the human experience that most people considered normal. This devastating truth emerged from Jung's decades of observing men who had successfully completed what he called the individuation process, the psychological journey of integrating all aspects of personality into a coherent, authentic whole. These weren't ordinary men who had achieved conventional success or happiness. They were individuals who had faced their shadow, integrated their anima, transcended their persona, and achieved what psychologists call self-actualization. Jung expected to find these men living in a state of enlightened contentment, but what he discovered was far more disturbing and complex. Jung's most unsettling observation was that self-actualized men had developed what he called cosmic indifference, a psychological state where they became fundamentally detached from the outcomes, opinions, and emotional reactions that drove most human behavior. They weren't depressed or nihilistic. They had simply transcended the psychological needs and fears that motivated normal human striving. This made them incredibly effective and powerful in pursuing their authentic purposes, but it also made them seem alien and incomprehensible to everyone around them, including their families, friends, and romantic partners. Have you ever met someone who seemed completely unaffected by criticism, praise, success, or failure in a way that was both impressive and slightly unsettling? The first brutal truth Jung discovered was that self-actualized men became emotionally unreachable in ways that devastated their personal relationships. Having integrated their emotional complexity and achieved psychological wholeness, they no longer needed external validation, emotional support, or intimate connection in the ways that created normal relationship dynamics. They could offer love, support, and presence to others, but they didn't need these things reciprocated, which paradoxically made their partners feel unnecessary and emotionally abandoned despite being treated with kindness and respect. Jung observed that wives and girlfriends of self-actualized men often reported feeling like they were in relationships with benevolent strangers. These men were present, caring, and emotionally available, but they didn't seem to need the relationship in any visceral, desperate, or passionate way. They loved without attachment, cared without dependency, and committed without desperation. While this sounds ideal in theory, in practice it created relationships that felt hollow and one-sided to partners who were accustomed to the intense emotional needs and psychological drama that characterized most romantic connections. The second devastating reality Jung uncovered was that self-actualized men became immune to the social and cultural forces that gave most people's lives meaning and direction. They were no longer motivated by status, wealth, social approval, or competitive achievement because they had developed internal sources of meaning and validation that made external recognition irrelevant. This made them incredibly free and authentic, but it also made them unemployable in conventional organizations and incompatible with social systems that depended on people's psychological needs and insecurities. Jung documented case after case of successful professionals, executives, and leaders who achieved self-actualization only to find themselves unable to continue in careers that had previously provided satisfaction and identity. They couldn't summon enthusiasm for goals that seemed arbitrary, couldn't engage in office politics that felt pointless, and couldn't maintain the personality masks that were required for professional success. Many of these men experienced what appeared to be career suicide as they walked away from lucrative positions that no longer aligned with their authentic values and purposes. The third brutal truth Jung discovered was that self-actualized men developed what he called the curse of clarity. They could see through the psychological games, unconscious motivations, and cultural illusions that most people lived within, but they couldn't unsee this reality or pretend to be unconscious again. They watched friends and family members repeat self-destructive patterns, chase meaningless goals, and create unnecessary suffering, but they found it increasingly difficult to offer help or support because their clarity made them seem condescending or detached, even when they genuinely cared. Can you imagine how isolating it would be to see the unconscious patterns and self-deceptions that drive most human behavior, while being unable to share this awareness without seeming arrogant or alienating others? Jung's clinical notes revealed that self-actualized men often experienced what he termed existential vertigo, a disorienting sense of standing outside normal human experience and observing it with the detachment of an anthropologist studying an alien culture. They could understand and even appreciate the fears, desires, and struggles that motivated others, but they could no longer participate authentically in these experiences. This created a profound loneliness that was different from ordinary social isolation. It was the loneliness of being awake in a world of sleepwalkers. The fourth devastating reality Jung uncovered was that self-actualized men became dangerous to existing social and cultural systems precisely because of their indifference to the psychological hooks that maintained social control. They couldn't be motivated by fear, seduced by status, or controlled through shame because they had transcended the psychological vulnerabilities that made these strategies effective. This made them natural leaders and revolutionary forces, but it also made them targets for social suppression and marginalization. Jung observed that institutions, whether religious, political, or economic, depended on people's psychological needs, fears, and insecurities to maintain compliance and participation. Self-actualized men, having resolved these internal conflicts, became immune to manipulation and control. They followed their authentic values regardless of social pressure, spoke truth regardless of consequences, and acted from internal authority rather than external approval. This made them both incredibly powerful and incredibly threatening to established power structures. The brutal psychological reality Jung discovered was that self-actualization wasn't a destination, but a point of no return. Once men achieved this level of psychological integration, they couldn't choose to be unconscious again, even when consciousness became burdensome. They were permanently transformed in ways that made normal human experiences, small talk, social gatherings, consumer culture, entertainment, and conventional relationships feel alien and exhausting. They had gained psychological freedom at the cost of social belonging. Jung's most disturbing finding was that many self-actualized men reported missing their previous unconscious state, even though they recognized it had been based on illusion and psychological limitation. They remembered when movies were entertaining rather than obvious emotional manipulation, when social interactions felt natural rather than scripted performances, when career success provided genuine satisfaction rather than empty achievement. They had gained clarity and authenticity, but lost the capacity for simple pleasure and unconscious enjoyment that made life feel effortless and fun. Have you experienced periods of personal growth where you gained important insights about yourself and reality, but found that this new awareness made previously enjoyable activities feel shallow or meaningless? The fifth brutal truth Jung uncovered was that self-actualized men often struggled with what he called the burden of potential. Having developed their full psychological and spiritual capacities, they became acutely aware of how much human suffering was unnecessary and how much human potential was wasted. They could see solutions to problems that others couldn't even recognize as problems, but they lacked the social influence or political power to implement changes on a meaningful scale. This created a painful sense of responsibility without corresponding ability to create positive impact. Jung documented how self-actualized men often became obsessed with finding ways to serve humanity and alleviate collective unconsciousness, but they discovered that most people weren't ready or willing to receive the insights that could help them. These men found themselves in the impossible position of having valuable gifts that few people wanted, solutions that few people would accept, and wisdom that few people could understand or apply. This created a sense of futility that was more painful than their previous unconscious struggles. The practical implications of Jung's discoveries were even more brutal than the psychological realities. Self-actualized men often found themselves financially struggling because they couldn't engage authentically in career paths that required psychological manipulation, competitive aggression, or values compromise. They had developed integrity and authenticity, that made them unemployable in systems that rewarded psychological unconsciousness and moral flexibility. Jung observed that these men often had to create entirely new ways of living and working that aligned with their psychological development. They became entrepreneurs, artists, teachers, or healers, not because these paths were easier or more lucrative, but because they were the only ways to maintain integrity while generating income. This often meant accepting financial insecurity and social marginalization as the price of psychological authenticity. Subscribe to this channel if you're seeking honest insights about the real costs and challenges of psychological development that most self-help content won't reveal. Like this video if you believe that understanding the brutal realities of consciousness helps prepare us for authentic growth rather than pursuing naive fantasies about self-improvement. Share this content with someone who's ready to face the real challenges of becoming whole rather than just becoming temporarily happier. Jung's analysis revealed that the solution to the brutal realities of self-actualization wasn't to avoid psychological development, but to understand and prepare for its true costs. He emphasized that men considering this path needed to count the cost honestly. They would likely lose many relationships, career opportunities, and sources of simple pleasure in exchange for authenticity, inner peace, and the capacity to serve others from a place of genuine wholeness rather than psychological neediness. The philosopher suggested that self-actualized men needed to find community with others who had undergone similar transformation, even though such people were rare. He observed that isolation was one of the most challenging aspects of self-actualization, and that finding even one or two other people who could understand and appreciate the journey made the loneliness bearable. These connections were qualitatively different from normal friendships. They were based on shared understanding of the costs and rewards of consciousness rather than shared interests or activities. Jung also emphasized that self-actualized men needed to develop what he called conscious service, finding ways to use their psychological development to benefit others without expecting recognition, appreciation, or even understanding. This service often took subtle forms, modeling authenticity, holding space for others' growth, or creating works of art, literature, or philosophy that could plant seeds of awareness in those ready to receive them. The brutal truth about self-actualized men, according to Jung's findings, also included the recognition that their transformation served a collective purpose beyond individual fulfillment. These men became what he called cultural seed points, individuals whose psychological development created possibilities for collective human evolution. Their willingness to pay the personal costs of consciousness contributed to the gradual awakening of human potential, even when this contribution wasn't recognized or appreciated in their lifetime. Jung's practical guidance for men facing the brutal realities of self-actualization included developing what he called sacred patience, the capacity to endure isolation, misunderstanding, and financial struggle while maintaining commitment to authentic development and service. This patience wasn't passive resignation, but active engagement with the challenges of conscious living, while trusting that their psychological development served purposes larger than personal satisfaction. Your own experience of finding conventional success unsatisfying, feeling alienated from social interactions that once felt natural, or struggling to maintain relationships after periods of intense personal growth may indicate that you're encountering the brutal realities that Jung discovered about self-actualization. Understanding these challenges as natural consequences of psychological development rather than personal failures can help you navigate them with greater wisdom and self-compassion. The ultimate insight from Jung's brutal discoveries about self-actualized men is that psychological wholeness comes with costs that most people aren't prepared to pay, but that these costs serve both individual authenticity and collective human evolution. The journey towards self-actualization isn't about becoming happier or more successful in conventional terms. It's about becoming real in ways that transform not only individual consciousness, but contribute to the gradual awakening of human potential. Jung's brutal truth stands as both warning and invitation. Self-actualization will cost you everything you think you want from life, but it will give you everything you actually need to serve your authentic purpose and contribute to human consciousness. The choice to pursue this path should be made with full awareness of its costs, because once begun, there's no turning back to unconscious simplicity, and the responsibility that comes with clarity is as challenging as it is meaningful.